Welcome everyone to the second International Conference on Environmental Peacebuilding Sessions on Climate Change and a New Colonialism, a case study on how a warming Arctic is raising issue of colonialism, conflict, and human rights. My name is Sarah Shu, and I will be the chair for this session. During this session, our panelists will first present, and then we'll have a moderated panelist discussion. And audience members are encouraged to put questions and comments in the chat, and we will have time at the end to answer some of those questions. So just a reminder of the conference's harassment policy, which I put in the chat with the link for more information, anti-harassment policy, anti-discrimination and harassment and retaliation policy. Now I'll be introducing the panelists. Our first panelist is Kristen Weiss. Kristen Weiss is a cultural anthropologist and PhD student at the Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution at George Mason University. Then presenting afterwards is Dr. Sarah Cobb. Dr. Sarah Cobb has a PhD in communication from UMass Amherst and is the Drusy French Cumby Chair at the Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution at George Mason University. Presenting next would be Ide Dijkstal, is a UK barrister at 33 Bedford Row Chamber in London, practicing international criminal law and international human rights law. And we'll also be joined by Dr. Aurora Martin, who is an anti-discrimination and gender expert. So Kristen Weiss, take it away.
Everyone, let me just share my screen quickly. I thought it'd be helpful to just start off with getting into the larger themes that we'll all be talking about today. So we're specifically looking at, as you all know for this session, at neocolonialism and kind of broader issues in the new Arctic. My personal expertise is in coastal community resilience and conflict in the Arctic, and I particularly look at the role of tourism in all of that. And so I wanted to talk about kind of what we're, when we talk about what's happening in the Arctic, what we're actually talking about, get some foundations first. So as we all know, the impacts of climate change are affecting coastal communities, everyone, but coastal communities in particular are affected, and that's exacerbated in the polar region. So the Arctic in particular, coastal communities in the Arctic face everything from melting permafrost, so the ground actually melting away, and finding stable foundations for your infrastructure, to erosion, increased kind of wave activity, storm surge. The ice is breaking up more, hitting the shoreline more. How to deal with those kinds of issues, and then with that, the impacts of climate change have kind of it's a two-headed sword. So with that comes the opportunity for opening shipping lanes in the Arctic. So where everything was covered in ice, as that ice melts, and now there's new mapped and lots of talk and lots of excitement and lots of opportunity for these new transportation routes that can cut through the Arctic and basically cut a lot of the major existing transportation routes in half in terms of distance and theoretically time. At the other end of that, the impacts of climate change, kind of all these issues that communities in the Arctic are facing, require a lot more development. Things get damaged, that costs money to repair. How are you going to find the funds to repair that? And then with the shipping, these transportation routes opening, this kind of general increased access to the Arctic happening, that requires a lot more development as well. So ports need to be developed to handle larger ships. With more people coming, there needs to be general infrastructure, and there's a lot of opportunity there, but there's also a lot of cost. So one of the ways that has been traditionally billed as a solution to these issues around the world that coastal communities face is tourism development. You can attract people to come spend money, and then they leave and you get to keep the money. general idea. But again, with that requires, the reality is that requires a lot of infrastructure. And so with this, this leads us to specifically what I wanted to talk about for my session is on this idea of sense of place and cultural heritage and the role of tourism in that. So basically, how do you attract people to your location? You need to sell a unique idea, a unique identity, some sort of unique offering that they don't have where they are that attracts them to travel to a new place. And sense of place itself is simply the, in the academic literature and the scientific literature, sense of place is simply the relationship between people and place. And place itself, not to get too into the weeds, but place itself is very different than a physical location. It's the collection of stories and memories and histories, fictional accounts, myths and legends, the stories you were raised with, all of those things, your personal day-to-day experiences in these places. That all forms your place and your sense of place. And that over time plays a huge role into cultural heritage as well. As that becomes inherited, cultural heritages, they kind of play off each other. Cultural heritage contributes to your sense of place, and your sense of place contributes to your cultural heritage. So traditionally, tourism is a way, that these things are very unique. And tourism is a way to commodify that and sell that. And so what I look at and kind of the concerns and questions that I really wanted to raise in this session today are the relationship between tourism and sense of place.
Kristen, your audio is coming in a little bit staticky for some audience members.
Okay. While I'm talking, I'll try to join from my phone as well, and just do audio through that. Or I'll do that. We'll just try to make it work for now. But so anyway, so essentially what we're looking at is with sense of place. If you're selling sense of place, if you're commodifying it, that starts to change it. If you have, say, with a common issue in the Arctic, having kind of these smaller cruise ships come in with 7,000, 8,000 people come from 8 to 5 p.m. for a day, what does that mean for how you as a local resident interact with your space? And what does that mean for that dynamic? And so it can some of the concerns with tourism is that you get benefits, but what are the trade-offs? And with that, tourism is also presented, especially for marginalized communities, often as a way to preserve cultural heritage. So if you have, say, something unique, say in the Arctic, the Sami have a tradition of reindeer herding. That is something that can be leveraged to attract tourists, and then you can sell that. So the upper right picture is kind of Sami reindeer tourism happening. And so you can kind of sell your cultural heritage, and then also by doing that in a certain way, the idea is that you can then also protect cultural heritage. And so the issues that I want to raise are kind of what are, these questions of what is preserved, and the only things that can be preserved in this context are the things that can be commodified. So if there are parts of your cultural heritage that cannot be sold for tourism or don't fit in the tourism narrative, then what happens to those? What is there to protect those aspects? And over time, these kind of tourism narratives that are built on cultural heritage can also turn into stereotypes that then have a lot of other harmful, disastrous effects in terms of policy making outside of tourism. And then the other related issue to this is really that these tourism narratives and these tourism experiences can kind of erode your sense of place, and the narratives that you have, that your community have about your place, can be eroded by and overwritten by these tourism narratives, these more marketing kind of PR narratives. So these are kind of the issues that I wanted to frame and start the panel with, and for time. And I know my audio's bad, so I'm going to try to fix that, and we can move on.
Thank you so much, Kristen. We'll move on to our next presenter, Dr. Sarah Cobb.
And that now I'm unmuted. That's according to me. Is that correct?
Yes, we can hear you. You are sharing your presenter view.
Yeah. So I would, let's see how to do the show that's not the presenter view is the question. Well,
Click use slideshow. Your mouse was just right over it in the top left corner.
top left corner, I don't see that.
You're right over it right now.
This one?
The use slideshow, yes.
Well, is that right? No. I don't see it. I don't have that as an option. I can end the show, but I don't have use slideshow as an option that I see. Okay. Well, let me start here rather than trying to, let me go ahead then. And this is the best we can do here. So this is a research that's funded by the National Science Foundation and my collaborators, Kristen, George Mason, along with the other group of people led by Elise Miller-Hooks in the College of Engineering. And we focused on, or I focused here on the relationship between narrative and colonial, neo-colonial, and decolonizing practices. This is a project that compares the analysis of a U.S. strategy, of policy narratives at the U.S. Arctic level and local community narratives. So I wanted to start out by clarifying with you how we're understanding a narrative. It has a bunch of components in general. They usually have a beginning, they have a beginning, middle, and end. These are meaning architecture or discursive architecture that have characters that struggle, they have traits and intentions, and they are anchored by a moral framework that provides what's called an evaluative point. So this is a definition of narrative. And if we look at what a risk narrative is, it could be understood as a story that describes an asset and its potential loss. They have turning points, which often in the course of the story, in the beginning, the middle, and the end, describe a turning point where something happened that generally accounts for the potential for a bad outcome of loss. They have some risk of morality, where they anchored by a set of moral frameworks. So we've got the moral frameworks that are helping us understand the turning points, and all of that is what's housing is the foundation for the assets and their potential loss. And we've got these characters that are positioned as either adding risk to loss or trying to struggle against it. So we did an analysis, John DeRosa, some colleagues, John DeRosa and others, of the policy documents, the strategy documents associated to the members of the Arctic Council, the permanent members, and the observer nations. And we coded over 34 documents, and we used John DeRosa's methodology to code targeting narrative, what's called a narrative proposition. And basically we looked at motives, perceptions, and preferences in these documents. And here's what we found at the policy level. Across these documents, if you look at the left-hand axis, we were coding them relative to the consequence of the loss. And the longitudinal is the bottom axis is the probability of the loss. So it's probability and consequence on the X and Y. And you can see here that for the member nations, this is member nations, there was a low probability of ecological disaster or disasters or ecological problems, but a slightly higher probability of them. A high consequence, I apologize, a high consequence of ecological problems, but a low probability. And environmental problems, which are more global and holistic, whereas the ecological were more about species, had a low level of probability and a low level of consequence. But if you compare that to the permanent members and their strategy documents, you see they've got ecological risks at a relatively high level of probability. This is one of the highest levels of probability in all of the strategy 34 documents we coded. And again, also very higher environmental probability of environmental problems. And of both of those were of relatively high consequence. So of course, the ecological risks are anchored in the indigenous knowledge, people that are living there and working with the problems that are resulting from climate change. So this is a really interesting difference that reflects, again, let me just take you back, the sort of experience near, experience far problem. And look at the role of security here, where it's of low probability there's going to be security problems, but higher probability and lower consequence. So this is a very interesting difference, I think. And you think you see this, colonialism in these policies where, the indigenous knowledge underlying probability and consequence of damage to the environment and the ecological systems is really at high risk, with ecological risk at the highest. But the member nations narrate ecological risk as high in consequence, but low in probability because they're not, of course, living there, clearly out of touch with indigenous knowledge, et cetera. So then what we did was go and interview people at local levels. And largely these interviews were, for the most part, with the exception of one, in Utiavik. And there were 7 in-depth interviews. They're not a lot, but they were, an hour or so long, each one, with person who lived in, one person in Canada and the rest in the Alaskan community. And what we did is look at the risk narratives to focus on what they saw, what these people saw as problematic outcomes, the loss, and how they named them in terms of the causes they framed them, that they used to frame them, and their relative consequence, right? And here are the nature of the losses that they identified. This was really a shock to me. It was very surprising. One was, and these are not in ranked order, please. So they're just notes on what the kinds of things people were talking about. I would like to go back to a group of local people and ask them to rank these to show us which ones are more important than others, but this list here doesn't reflect that. They talked about the suppression of differences and the inability to discuss them. And they saw that as a risk to the community. And the inability to discuss them was related to, I'll talk about that in the next section, but it was related to the presence of colonial hierarchies inherited from colonial periods that were reproduced in and through the relationship with the extraction industry. So these hierarchies are alive and well, but they end up suppressing the people's ability to talk about their differences. They are associated to, they worried about the loss of tolerance and trust in the community. They talked about the loss of traditional forms of governance anchored in indigenous practices and the adoption of Western models of governance. That was a loss. They talked about the traditional values, the indigenous knowledge and languages as a loss. They talked about the threat to traditional foods, hunting and fishing. That was a very important topic. They talked about the loss, not less, but it is less, but they talked about it, the loss of community participation, or at least less community participation, and the increase of apathy. They talked about the loss of food security. They talked about the loss of markers, going back to what Kristen was saying, these markers of place that they grew up with, and they might be a tree or they might be a grave site. And as the permafrost has melted and the change have been wrought on the community, there's a loss of the relationship, the holistic relationship between people and place, as Kristen was mentioning. They talked about the loss of jobs for Indigenous people and the way in which those are often following these hierarchies given to people who are either outside of the community or outside of the tribe. And they talked about the loss of health, increases of alcoholism and suicide rates, for instance. Now, in those stories, they told me, here's how they attributed the causes of that. They talked about lateral violence explicitly. Again, this blew me away, that they were explicitly referring to traditional power hierarchies inherited from colonialism that led to infighting, backfighting, and fractures within the community itself, which they called explicitly as lateral violence. And they said that is perpetuated through public shaming and humiliation and retaliation processes. They talked about the cause of traditional knowledge of hazards is really sidelined by experts. And they feel they've got all this knowledge that's not then picked up, for instance, by the Army Corps of Engineers or planning processes. They talked about the presence of snow fences, and snow fences actually restrict people's movements to campsites and for hunting. They talked about a time when there was a cruise ship that landed and had to land actually, and they wiped out all the groceries. And given that they're only delivered once a week, it was a very serious problem for people not to have food. They talked about the way in which oil money and the tribal corporation has people dependent on the oil economy, on a cash economy particularly, and how that's a loss. They talked about the reduced focus on climate change as a long-term process. And this, they talked about their own loss. It's not just in the policy documents. They said, look, we're so busy dealing with daily problems and daily struggles, we don't really have time to step back and do the kind of long-term planning that's required by climate change. Now, I would make a footnote on that. And they said, look, we're Indigenous folks and we know how to adapt. We are resilient. So they didn't worry so much about the long-term planning processes because they knew they had the skills to adapt in the short term. And that was one of their strengths that they discussed. They talked about the cause of these losses related to Western model of governance, as I mentioned, and that in turn embedded in colonial histories. And they talked about conflict over budgets, that they end up splitting and fracturing the community as they're trying to worry about where to put the money for schools or roads or whatever. And these are really perpetuating the colonial practices, right? And neo-colonial practices where the US Arctic policy is tilted towards the interest of the state, largely security, and they reinforce the gap with local communities, which are, security is not on the map. They're not, food security is, and the security of relationships and the security of traditional practices, but not the security of global nations. It's just not on the radar at all. That local, and yet it's central to US policy and strategy. They talked about these local community hierarchies really being able to reflect the history of power and the privilege from colonialism. And of course, they're anchored in the oil industry, as I mentioned, and that conflicts in the community can go unaddressed, perpetuating the trauma of colonialism and the presence of lateral violence. So here's some implications, I think. One is, it's really interesting to think about peace building, conflict resolution, conflict transformation processes where, this gap between the policy and the local communities could be addressed and could be explicitly discussed And you can imagine kinds of listening sessions and workshops and, you know, forms of narrative engagement that would enable that to happen, which I'm not, let me say that the US strategy, Arctic strategy, was developed in 2013, and there hasn't been a new one. So it's not like this isn't a developed and vibrant new policy. They're in the process of developing one in the Biden administration, but we're talking about, you know, relatively, you know, this is a 9-year-old policy here. I think you could do a lot to surface some of these hidden transcripts that are in the Indigenous communities and in the community writ large to help them look at and think about the fractures that are there. And of course, these processes could be led by elders and local leaders, right? I think that if there were an attempt in the US at the US policy level to centralize local needs rather than the security needs of the state, that would be a good idea. And then you could embed Indigenous knowledge in critical places in US policy making processes. And right now there's 2 new bodies that Biden has just appointed some folks in October, the Arctic Executive Steering Committee, which is going to be co-led with the Tribal Advisory Council. So there's already this kind of meetup of Indigenous and more traditional research folks. And then there's the U.S. Arctic Research Commission, which has got 6 members, and 2 of them have history and experience as Indigenous people working with Indigenous communities and in leadership positions. And while 2 out of 6 is only a third, it's a step in a good direction, I think. And then I think the last thing is to have some kind of inclusive and diverse input into the creation of the next draft of the U.S. Arctic strategy. And these 2 committees would support that. But I think there needs to be, again, these sort of listening sessions that would ensure the U.S. strategy policy is anchored in local knowledge to begin with. So those are my thoughts, and thank you for listening. There's a bibliography too I can share with the people. And I'll stop the share.
Thank you, Dr. Cobb. We'll now be moving on to Ide Dijkstal to present, and a reminder that you can put comments and questions in the chat.
Well, thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you to everyone that's here and to the organizers of this conference for bringing everyone together to talk about this very interesting and important issue. What we've heard so far is about the impacts of climate change and warming in the Arctic, and how these changes are bringing development and increased access to the region. We've also heard during our discussion about the impact these changes are having on local communities, including Indigenous communities, to their livelihoods, to their identity, and to their cultural heritage. So I approach this topic from a bit of a different perspective and a different point of view. I'm going to approach it from the perspective of the law, and particularly international law. What I want to discuss today is how international human rights law and potentially even international criminal law can address the situation of local communities when their lives and their rights are affected by the increased access to their communities and their coastlines, by large-scale developments and the exploitation of natural resources, all of which lead to, and which we've seen lead to in other places experiencing increased development, environmental damage, abuse of land acquisitions, loss of culture and identity, and the loss of the ability to determine the future of their lands for themselves. I want to first start with the impact on local communities, international human rights. When we talk about human rights of people under this area of law, we look at the obligation of states and governments to ensure and to protect certain fundamental human rights to the people within their territories. States signing human rights treaties are agreeing to an obligation to protect and guarantee the rights listed within those documents. And when they're violated, the state is agreeing to address the violations and provide a remedy. The violation does not need to come from state actors. It can be from, for example, a corporation working on development projects. But just because the government was not the alleged perpetrator of a human rights violation doesn't mean that the state therefore has no obligation. The state retains the obligation to investigate when there's a human rights violation alleged, and to address that violation and provide a remedy for that violation. So when we see communities in the Arctic finding themselves in situations where the power dynamic has suddenly changed, and where the lands they have traditionally lived upon are being transformed by outside sources, we look to some human rights which might be affected. At first glance, I think we must keep in mind key human rights like the right to self-determination, and whether these communities truly have the ability to determine for themselves the course of their development with this emerging power dynamic. We must also think about the right to live and practice their cultural heritage, and the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. So are these rights being suppressed and impacted by the changes to their areas and to their regions? Key human rights documents, such as the Universal Declaration on Human Rights and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, set out guarantees to the right to participate in the cultural life of the community and the right to enjoy one's own culture. It is therefore the obligation of states to ensure that regardless of, and also in light of, what's happening with development, that there is bringing change, that's bringing this change to the communities, that the rights of individuals and communities to take part in their culture is fully protected. Another right that we must also consider is the right to free expression. It is not one that you think automatically of when we think about what's happening in the Arctic as a result of climate change and development and access coming to the area. But we hear about the struggles of local communities to voice their concerns and opinions. And therefore, we think about whether the environment that's being created by all of these changes supports the free exercise of this right, or whether that's being diminished through these changes. The last right that I want to bring up is the right to development, because I think it's one of the most important rights to the communities facing these type of changes we've heard about in the Arctic. The right to development is strongly linked to the right to self-determination. It is enumerated in foundational human rights treaty bodies that many countries in the Arctic have joined, including the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights that I mentioned before. It's in the Declaration on the Right to Development. And we see developments in the right through litigation through regional human rights courts like the African Commission in Court and the Inter-American Human Rights System. What the right to development sets out is that all people shall have the right to economic, social, and cultural development, which human rights treaties linked to the right to freely determine their status. Litigation on this right has resulted in findings that states have a duty to ensure that individuals and communities can exercise the right to development. So this means that the state is not only obliged to protect the right of individuals and communities to development, but it bears the burden for creating conditions favorable to people's development. It's the state's primary responsibility to assist with this realization of this right. This duty is where the obligation to consult with local communities stems. What regional human rights courts have found is that the right to development is closely aligned with the issue of participation. Individuals and communities have the right to participate and contribute to their development. And the UN has found that they should be active participants and beneficiaries of the right to development. Therefore, this duty is on states. And it means that in order to create favorable conditions for development and assist with communities' realization of this right through participation in decisions which are going to affect them, there is a duty to conduct good faith consultations. And these human rights bodies have interpreted this to mean that states must provide information to the communities about decisions or actions that might affect their rights. And they must be in constant communication with all of the parties who are going to be affected to get their opinions, to get their thoughts, because they are the ones that are best placed to provide feedback about how things are going to impact them and the best way to mitigate those impacts so that it doesn't have as great of an impact on their rights, like the right to self-determination, to culture, to their livelihoods that we've discussed before. So it's not for the communities to bear the burden of finding a way to voice their concerns or their choices or their decisions in the midst of powerful actors. It's the state's obligation to ensure that these communities are included as active participants in the conversations and decisions that will most impact them. For the state not to create such an environment would be a breach of the community's right to development and could be raised on the international level as a human rights violation. What I think is important is that a conversation is started now about these fundamental rights, which must be guaranteed as development grows in this region, so that not only local communities are aware of the rights which might assist them with maintaining their space and their power to determine for themselves what changes will come to their communities, but also so governments are reminded, not informed, but reminded, because they should know already, of their obligations to support and ensure these rights and the community's ability to exercise them. Now, that was international human rights law. I want to end by raising one thought under another area of international law, under international criminal law. We hear of countless reports on the effect of natural resources, development projects, and increased access, such as shipping routes, having an impact on local communities when they lead to land grabs, environmental destruction during the projects, and ultimately to further climate change, which in turn increases the incidence of rising sea levels, floods, and destructive storms. It continues to build on itself. The result of this is overwhelmingly the forcible transfer and deportation of local communities from their homes. The question is whether this situation, when the culmination of these impacts leads to people being effectively evicted from their lands and from their homes, could be addressed as an international crime. Here, what I think is important to watch is the use of the crime against humanity of forcible transfer and deportation as an international crime when these situations arise. When we think of this crime of deportation or forcible transfer, we think of governments physically forcing populations to move. For example, loading people into trucks against their will or serving eviction notices where people are physically forced out of a certain area. But what we have to remember is that this crime under international law also applies to when people are forced to flee their homes because of the impact of what is termed as coercive acts on the local population. We must consider whether environmental destruction, which makes land unlivable or which affects a population's ability to continue their livelihoods, is a coercive act. Would that be a coercive act that pushes people off of their lands and causes them to flee? We also have to consider whether land grabs can be considered coercive acts, and whether the resulting climate change, which brings rising sea levels and other changes to coastal communities, can be considered to coercively impact the local communities so that they have no choice but to flee. It's clear that local communities are being increasingly impacted by these changes and developments, and that this will grow as climate change continues to transform the region. I think it's key to be aware of how international law, both international human rights law and the potential for international criminal law, and how these can impact, how they can assist the communities, how communities can be aware of their benefits and the pressure that they can put on states to consider what's happening to local communities and change the behavior so it's for the benefit of everyone. I think it's potentially an avenue for justice when the situation requires, and it's something that we should be thinking about now before the situation becomes worse and worse. And so I'm going to end there, and I'm very happy to take any questions when we get to that point. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Ide. And now we're opening it for the discussants if you wanted to comment or ask questions to each other. If not, I can ask a question. How can we bring more traditional knowledge and culture into international discussion, policy, and processes like enforcement of human rights?
I would like to address the question in the chat to me, and this person is asking, somebody's asking a really, Kenlia is asking a really great question about, would simply the appointment of people to positions of power in DC, whether it's at DOI, the Department of Interior, or some of these committees I was mentioning prior to the creation of the US Arctic Strategic Plan, is that going to make a difference, right? And I think that, you know, it's a good direction. And, you know, we've all been, I don't know about, there are a lot of women on this conference. I was looking at the gender balance a minute ago, and not everybody's pronouns are up there, but it's pretty heavily women. And at least I've been in plenty of meetings where, you know, I didn't feel able to speak. So depending on the dynamics in the room and the power and et cetera, you know, it's not necessarily the case that people will be heard, you know, even if they're there and present, whether they can speak and really have the authority to get their narratives adopted as a separate question. But I'm delighted that there seems to be more representation at higher levels of government. I don't think that's gonna be the only thing we need to do, because I think these communities, at least the ones I'm describing, are already so deeply impacted the way, you know, Heidi was talking about, and Kristen as well. They're so deeply impacted already that there's got to be some kind of local redress, local conversations, local, you know, we've got to be able to talk about justice and social justice in those areas. And unless those topics can be raised, the US policy is not going to help those communities be able to talk about those things any better. So I'm hoping it's a more comprehensive strategy, but yes, I'm delighted about it. Thank you for the question.
And I would just add that I think there's, as Sarah was saying, it's certainly an indication of positive change in terms of you know, changing the power dynamics and making sure that the voices of those who are most impacted are heard. But I also think we should be cautious about whether or not the actual infrastructure in terms of decision-making systems, if those systems are changing, if the machine itself is changing, or are we just replacing a few cogs, if that makes sense. So I think in general, it's just something to be on the lookout for, and the phenomenon of the token, where a minority of some kind, say, there's a really great podcast, I think it was Malcolm Gladwell's podcast called The Token, or a podcast episode called The Token, for revisionist history. And just to bring a little pop culture into it. And essentially, I think we should always be cautious of when, say, a woman or some a member of a marginalized group or minority is put into a position of power, that there is a pattern of backlash against that. And then that is used as justification to not make any further changes for equality. And so I think when we look at decision-making processes in terms of local versus federal or national or international, we should certainly look at the actual system itself more than the individuals that are representing that system.
Thank you. Ken Leah has posted another question. I was wondering if panelists would be interested in answering. We are seeing the emergence of rights of nature being ruled on, sometimes in favor of it, in a variety of countries. How do you see this movement influencing the events you are all presenting on today?
Well, I'm just going to jump in there. I think the right to nature is not one that's particularly phrased in that way under international human rights law, but I think it has a lot of parallels to this movement that's starting to develop about the intersection between the rights concerning environmental law and how that's linked to human rights. I think that there is a growing movement that's looking at the way that the environment impacts individuals and communities, and how that affects human rights. And we're seeing things like the crime of ecocide being developed and beginning to be discussed, or the right to clean air. I think these all have to do with viewing environment and nature and the rights that stem from that as a priority and fundamental to human beings' human rights. And I think that it's great to see that there's more and more attention that's being paid to that. I do want to just make one comment. There was somebody who said, are there any publications that address the human rights and especially crimes against humanity having to do with environmental law? And I do have a paper that's coming out on that in the next month or so. So I'll post it to my Twitter, I suppose might be the best way to circulate that. But I'll end there.
Well, I guess I would like to add this question's interesting about the rights of nature. One of the things that has happened, at least in the Arctic, that I've been at local communities I've looked at, is that the lines of fracture are not clearly drawn. They're not tidy. So you don't have people, there are people in favor of regulation of extraction industry and, pulling out of tribal corporations and separating indigenous communities from extraction industry. There are people who are advocating that. It's great. But, there's a lot of dependency on oil in the high north, or at least in Alaska and Nunavut. So it'd be interesting because you might end up arguing for the rights of nature, right? And reducing the impacts of climate change on people. And folks themselves would be, wait a second, we're not necessarily in favor of that. So I think it just is very, when the lines are so fuzzy and people are all over, they're taking a bunch of different positions, and they are local people and even indigenous peoples, right? Whose voices we want to elevate. It's not clear to me that the law, which, as Robert Cover said, is jurisπathic, it kills off narratives. That's what the law does, to say, this one's okay, this one's not. That the jurisπathic, it's not clear to me that the jurisπathic approach is going to be constructive. And that's why I think this panel, the environmental peace building process of trying to, bring folks together and see what's working and what are the stories that are lurking there, and how do we, how do we excavate some of these conflicts and help people design their own solutions, is somehow, it's the old argument, Haiti, between, are the courts sufficient? Or, they're necessary, but are they sufficient for addressing some of these complexities? And I'd love to hear your response to that too.
Well, as far as whether they're sufficient or not, no, I don't think they're meant to do everything, but it's certainly one way to address people's rights, and also to try to change behavior of offenders against the environment and against people as well.
Very nice.
Yeah, and just in response to the question about indigenous ontologies and epistemologies changing Western ways of thinking about nature. From a resource management perspective, I think this is one of the reasons why a key argument in needing to have the voices of those who are most impacted at the table on a more, from my perspective and my work, on a more local level. That there's a huge, in general, kind of philosophical debate between anthropocentric, right, and biocentric. So, do things have value because they have value to us, or do they have value independent of their value to us? And I think as that conversation is becoming a more and more common conversation to have in the resource management space, and I think across a few other spaces, that it kind of raises these questions. It's starting to raise these questions alongside, kind of in parallel with these cultural preservation questions of, well, why are we trying to do this development or this project? What are the benefits, and who are those benefits going to? In tourism development, for just as an example, there's a concept of economic leakage, and essentially the money that is spent in that community, how much of that is staying in that community, just purely from an economic perspective. And so, for example, if there's a foreign-owned business, a big hotel chain, or a cruise ship, or many, those are just kind of the typical examples, but there are many different examples of this. Have a where the destination becomes the commodity, becomes the product that they're selling. So locals may work at that hotel, but the tourism revenue that hotel generates doesn't stay in that country even, or in that community. There's a lot of leakage. So the money is spent in this place, but it doesn't stay there. And these are kind of, out of these questions of nature and the value of nature and protection of nature, kind of parallel to that is, who are we protecting this for, or what are we protecting, or why are we protecting it? And so I think it's all kind of, these discussions are all closely related, and will hopefully merge into policymaking processes that allow for perspectives other than the dominant perspective, or from Sarah's research, dominant narratives, and kind of what's being overwritten, and what's being lost. That helps.
I could jump in on that one as well. I think it's a great question as far as how Indigenous communities and local communities can change the way of Western thinking on this. And I think I completely agree with Kristen that it comes down to consultations. And what I had been raising, that consultations are not only important, but they're a right, and they're an obligation of governments and businesses or corporations to engage with local communities. I think what these local communities, indigenous communities really can bring, that can change the way of thinking, is how the environment is linked to their culture. I mean, oftentimes when we're looking at human rights, the destruction of the environment or acts that that are destroying land and the environment around people can be viewed not only as an environmental law violation, but also as a violation to the right to culture. And that's very much because for many people, the environment is intrinsically linked to their culture. I mean, I'm looking at examples like the way that oil pipelines affect the environment. Well, it's not only the environment for many of those local communities, but their culture, their religion, their traditions, or it's not about access to water. It's the way that their link and their association between that environmental factor, like a body of water, to their religion, to their culture. So I think it's those consultations that are going to bring that to light and to force the Western way of thinking that doesn't take these things into account to recognize that, to include that in their decision making. So really pressing on these obligations and making sure that they're not overlooked and that they're respected and ensured.
Thank you for all those thoughtful replies to the questions in the chat. Are there any other questions from audience members at this time?
Yeah, I think Kenlea is making an interesting comment there. She's talking about, practice, the practice of making relationships with people, right? And somehow part of what I think we need to deepen, and I have some ideas on this, but sometimes I'm hopeless. We need to deepen our understanding of what's required, what the parameters are that constitute participation. Because local consultation can be, that's what the Army Corps of Engineers is going to do in Etiavik, right? They're going to go up there and consult with the community on the putting in the seawall that's been paid for, $364 million, and it's going to alter people's access to the water and the tides and how they understand the beach and, the whole way the community's laid out. It's going to make a difference. And of course, it's folks not living there studying the problem of increased erosion and the high storms and coastal flooding, and the engineers trying to solve that problem. But the consultation is often in the form of these town meetings, right? Where folks are raising their hand and then somebody else raises their hand. And then guess what? All those hand raisings don't add up to alterations in the potential, the sort of strategies that could be used, or the technologies that could be introduced, or even the process timeline or anything else. And I've seen this, I've done some work with the EPA, and I see the technical people go into a community like the EPA who, consult the community, and basically it's a pro forma thing that whoosh, goes right over the heads of folks using all kinds of technical language. And none of the things that the community cares about get, embedded in that. So I'm basically trying to argue that we need to get really smart of what consultation means and design processes that would actually stick, where folks are going to say things that then get make a difference. Because otherwise it's like the student movement said in 1969 in France. I participate, you participate, they participate, we participate, you participate, they win. So how do we make consultations actually work? What's our standard? What are the parameters for how that would look? So I just wanted to, thank Kenlea for her comment about how do we, basically it's about the practice of this, and I don't think we're there.
I think that's such a fantastic point, and it's so important. I mean, what we want to make sure is that these consultations are also not used just to tick a box. and
Well
that
said.
they actually are meaningful and results in actual influence that these communities are able to have over the decisions that are being made. So yeah, thank you so much for raising that. That's a great ongoing question that I think all of us are very interested in.
Yeah, I would just add in response to one of the questions, and Sarah, you may want to speak more to this on kind of how the interviews were conducted or how the data was collected, but kind of related to the consultation idea, there's, I think, growing awareness in academia on kind of the neo-colonial extractive processes in data collection and research. You know, there's of course always a lot of interest, and from my perspective, this relates a lot to tourism, whereas academic tourism or educational tourism, you know, wanting to go to quote unquote an exotic place, wherever that may be, you know, be able to do research, have a grand adventure, come back, and then professionally and personally benefit from kind of the information that people have given you, and from a certain standpoint, you know, that could be argued for kind of any data collection, but I think particularly this is an issue for the Arctic that is increasingly being raised, you know, by members, in my experience, by members of Indigenous communities who have said, you know, we have experts, we have expertise, you know, like there needs to be like kind of there's, and I think there's an increasing awareness from researchers outside of the Arctic that the way that research is conducted and the way that data is collected needs to be in a non-extractive way, in a way that actually provides, you know, clear benefit back to community members who are participating, you know, wherever that is, especially in the Arctic.
So yeah, I'd like to, I'm sorry, I didn't see that question. It's a great one. And what we did was we have a local expert who then I asked for names of people to interview, people that they thought might be interested in speaking with me. And I did interviews with them talking about wanting to have their perspectives. And the strategy I'd like to do is to then form a research team in the community itself, people who would have interest to do that. And they would be the ones vetting, participating in the analysis and vetting findings, so that I don't end up, you know, myself in my study coding narratives by myself and then coming up with conclusions about what they mean. We're not there yet because I haven't been able to find the people that would want to form that research team. And I think I haven't been able to do that because of COVID. So, you know, we can't go to the communities. So part of what this says, you know, talk about sort of intensifying colonial practices of research, data collection. COVID has been a perfect storm for, I believe, the, you know, the risk of that, which I've tried to mitigate by moving through, you know, local representatives and people who are anchored there. But I really would like to have a full-on research team there that would be, you know, helping anchor the analysis itself. That would be my goal. But thank you for the question. And let me just add that, you know, there's like research fatigue up there. You know, this the NNA funding that we have, the Navigating the New Arctic funding from NSF, has just, you know, catapulted lots of quote unquote scientists into the community, and people are, you know, doing sea level rise studies and permafrost studies and social science studies, and, you know, people are studied to death. And in the meanwhile, the community is inundated with all the, you know, just like the rest of us, but maybe even more so, problems related to the pandemic and educating their children and poor internet connections and loss of revenue for jobs and things like that. So it's a community under siege with COVID, and very, very high rates of COVID as well. So, you know, for that reason, I think Kristen and I have decided not to pursue more interviews for a while, because we are stalled out from building the quality of the relationships by being there and or putting together this second order team. So I'm going to start modeling, do some modeling work on conflict, sort of as a way to move while in place, waiting for opportunities to be more connected to the community. But thank you for the question.
It sounds like there's on this panel an agreement that there is a lot of traditional knowledge and culture that should be elevated and used in government consultations, as well as like protected as a human right. What is the role of maybe peace building institutions or institutions in general in this process?
Could you ask the question again? I was reading one of the comments and couldn't think.
Sure, yeah. It sounds like we've talked a lot about the communities and the community knowledge, but what might be the roles of institutions or institutions interested in the Arctic in supporting and protecting human rights? Like, what is the role of maybe peace building institutions?
So when I'm hearing for your, I guess my question back would be, what are we thinking about when we think about peace building institutions? Are we talking about NGOs or more formal organizations like the UN? Because I do think that there's very different roles when it comes to that. But I think it really goes back to what we're saying again about consultations and doing so in a meaningful way that's sensitive to cultures there and helps to bring these voices forward. I think it's about trying to amplify their messages and what they want to voice about the changes that are happening. As far as larger institutions like the UN, I think it's, these things like the right to development are really newly developed human rights, and they're becoming more and more linked to the environment, to culture, to how they're all interrelated, and it's just really encouraging looking at those rights in that way and how they're all linked together, so that when groups are approaching places like the UN or regional human rights bodies, that there's an openness to receiving that information and viewing the accounts that are coming to these bodies in that manner through those intersections of the different rights and how they play upon each other.
Well, I would add that I think that this is such an interesting question there about, the question I was looking at was really about how do you have engaged with more heart and spirit and the side of the ecological peace building, and what's the role of environmental peace building in general. And one of the issues that I have, and I have two answers to that. One is, the way we evaluate projects. So you get funders, whether it's federal agencies or, NGOs or foundations or whatever, funding projects for environmental peace building, around in the Arctic. And, the way they are assessed, if you look at the measurements for evaluation, they're terrible. How many people participated in it, so the metrics that are used to make sense, to account for change, are terrible. And they're often not tied back to folks and how they are understanding things from the communities and what they want to do. So, I think we need different metrics. I think we need entirely different metrics. I would commend the work of Pamina Fearchow, and she wrote this book, Everyday Peace Indicators, and basically has a strategy for doing focus groups in communities. They come up with the indicators of peace, resilience, environmental reconstruction, whatever, you fill in the blank of your concept that you want to study from the local perspective. And they end up getting these indicators from folks that they then rank order, and then they design their programs on the basis of those. So peace may mean being able to go to the outhouse at night, or peace may mean I can send my daughter to college, to school during the day, or environmental improvement may need, that my children want to engage in fishing and hunting, which right now they're not interested in. So it could be all kinds of things, but we really have to ask the communities what they mean. So I think if we would improve, a la, Pamina Fairchild's work, the metrics we use for assessing environmental peace building, that's one thing that we could do a lot better in. And I think the other is that, I did this work, again, I was mentioning this work I did for the EPA on environmental peace building, and the heart, this question asks about the heart and the spirit of doing the work. And for me, the heart lies in building the relationships with the communities so that the people matter and that they feel heard and that their ideas can be included, and that it's not just in war with or up against federal agencies, but that really relationships are developed. And there's something, when it works, it really is a fantastic partnership and everybody wins, and then there can be ritual, etc. One of the things that I've been getting after the EPA about is they go in there and clean up these Superfund sites, for instance, and you can imagine this can happen in the Arctic and in terms of climate degradation. They do whatever they can do to improve the situation, and then it's done, the project's over. And you need ritual, you need parties, you need, connections between people to try to build the quality of relationships over time, so that there's sustainable resources, relational resources for people, not just in communities, but also at the policy level too. So I think we have to start thinking about sustainable relationships when we think about heart and spirit, and how do we do the work? Thank you, great question.
I could jump in on that one as well. I mean, I think that I really do take this from a different perspective, because the work that I do is on behalf of clients, oftentimes clients being people from these communities. And so I'm not going there to study or to look from the outside and create my own opinions or thoughts on this. What I do is I act on behalf of people on their instructions, and to bring forward their cases, their stories. So very much focused on raising what's happened to them, working to address their goals in raising human rights or international crimes. But it's their story, it's their case that they're bringing forward, and that's very much my focus.
And then I would just add a slightly different perspective from Sarah. This is my, I'm a doctoral student with an American university, but previously I was, my master's is from Icelandic University. And so the way that research is conducted has been an interesting comparison for me. And I think the long and short of it is that the Icelandic system is much less bureaucratic and much less regulated in a sense, and it comes from a different cultural framework. From my experience and my understanding is that it's where you don't, for example, you don't have to say please and thank you, because why would you? There's a different assumption in kind of exchanging and how you interact with society, I would say, and that translates over into how research is done as well. Where and how it was explained to me once, in Icelandic, you just say, can I have the pen? You don't say, can I have the pen, please? Thank you for the pen, because why would you have to say please? Of course they would offer you the pen. Whereas in our society, I think that the please and thank you brings about a different implication or a different set of assumptions for why you would have to do that, if that makes sense. And so anyway, so essentially, where I've done research before under kind of non-US institutions, and I think also just different, with COVID and being virtual, it's very different than being in person. But I did research in Dominica, which I think just anecdotally, I think there are a lot of parallels with Arctic coastal communities. from being an attractive place for researchers to do research, from the towards the path of tourism development, et cetera. So there, my experience was that being, when you're talking to people and when you're interviewing, and kind of living in that community, very clearly as a guest, but you start to understand the nuances a little bit better. That I think what Sarah was alluding to as well is that are kind of lost in the virtual, Zoom interviews or exchanges where the interaction is very limited. You lose the body language, volume of communication. You lose being able to get lunch, before or after the interview, that sort of thing. And so it's the nuance in the responses, I think, are different. And I think that also relates to being in the community. You can start to understand what they're talking about. When they're talking about what it's like to have a beach, like kind of be a beach vendor, or what it's like to be a tour guide in a certain area, or what it's like to be a fisher, but only on the weekends, because the rest of the time you have to be a taxi driver for the tourists because you don't make as much money fishing anymore, or whatever it may be. I think the way that people talk about, especially interpersonal dynamics, and obviously very relevant to my research, their sense of place. It's a lot easier to understand what they're even talking about when you're able to kind of understand that through multiple avenues beyond just what they're actually telling you. So it's almost like you need your own perspective to be shifted, so that you can even understand what they're talking about and kind of the nuance there, so you can accurately represent it in research.
Thank you to all the panelists for your thoughtful answer. I would like to take a moment to recognize Dr. Aurora Martin, who's also on this call. Dr. Martin has lost their voice, and so I will be reading a short statement about also the topic of this session. So climate change represents a considerable threat to poor farmers and rural communities in developing countries. Even a small increase in local temperatures could lead to reduced crop yields for those living at lower latitudes, especially in seasonally dry and tropical regions. More frequent and extreme weather events, such as droughts and floods, are expected to make local crop production even more difficult. Rural households tend to rely heavily on climate-sensitive resources, such as local water supplies and agricultural land, climate-sensitive activities, such as arable farming and livestock husbandry, and natural resources, such as fuel, wood, and wild herbs. Climate change can reduce the availability of these local natural resources, limiting the options for rural households that may depend on natural resources for consumption or trade. Land may become less fertile, fewer reeds may be available for basket making, there may be less local fuel wood for cooking. Shifts in climate will bring different changes to different regions. Some areas may see greater natural resources because of increased rainfall, for example, but on balance, the poorest regions are most likely to suffer because they are the least able to adjust to new conditions. The world's less industrialized regions are particularly vulnerable to the effects of climate change. In rural areas specifically, environmental change has immediate and direct effects on the health and well-being of millions of households that depend on natural resources for their basic livelihoods. When weather changes reduces families' livelihoods options, these changes can act as push factors. People leave resource-dependent rural areas and create new migration patterns. Because migration represents a tremendous force of social change, the potential for climate change to increase migration deserves careful consideration and policy attention. A link between migration and climatic factors, such as temperature and precipitation, has been documented in several rural regions of developing countries. In Burkina Faso, for example, residents of dry rural areas are likely to migrate to rural regions with greater rainfall. In this way, migration may be a long-term response to the threat of recurrent droughts. Still, only short-distance moves appear to be affected by climatic factors. Since international migration tends to be less common in a period of rainfall shortage, perhaps because of the investment required for international move. Migration is one of the many survival strategies used by Ethiopian households in times of environmental stress. Other survival strategies include using food reserves, seeking local non-farm employment, selling livestock, borrowing food, or selling household and farm equipment. Still, once these livelihood options are exhausted, people often migrate to new areas. Agriculture and forestry management can play a key role in mitigating the impacts of climate change and in promoting adaptation at the local level. Poor rural people, many of whom are indigenous peoples, depend on natural resources for their livelihoods. They are often the custodians of natural resource base and can play a key role in protecting ecosystems that benefit everyone. People who are struggling to feed themselves and their family are often forced to resort to short-term solutions, such as cutting down trees for firewood instead of preserving forests. In order for poor rural people to play an active role in climate change mitigation, it is essential that they are compensated for their activities that contribute to mitigation. It's a win-win situation for their families and for the whole planet. So that's the Dr. Martin's contribution at this time.
Well, I'd love to just make a comment and say, you know, I just really celebrate you highlighting and underlining this issue that I think Heidi was also referring to. Am I saying your name right, Heidi?
It's Ide, but
Ide, I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's all right.
That Ide was referring to, because I think that, you know, this question of migration is a very complicated issue in displacement, migration and displacement, and you know, and tied up with human rights, which I'll let you speak to. But you know, a huge I think it's almost 150 million people are projected to be migrating across Africa and Southeast Asia and you know, from the coastal regions around the world, islands in particular. So this is going to be a mess. And if we look at conflicts like the one in Darfur, right, there have been plenty of really good research that shows the conflict in Darfur was directly a function of changing climates and the conflict that emerged between peoples there as a result of who was moving into other people's territories. So I think, you know, we haven't begun really to fully take on what this means globally and in terms of policy and probably the law as well. But I really appreciate your erudite description of what's at stake here and what it means, particularly for rural people who are dependent on agriculture. Thank you.
I would, you know, second that. Aurora, Dr. Martin is also an expert on knowledge sharing and does a lot of work on a kind of community knowledge sharing, just for everyone's reference. With kind of migration too, one of the issues in my work, you know, kind of trying to address or figure out with coastal communities is that they the migration patterns are actually moving to the coast. You know, coastal areas are increasingly urbanized. The infrastructure costs are increasing, and they're also you know, significantly impacted by the impacts of climate change, storm damage, erosion. You know, all of those I think classic impacts that we commonly reference. And because the migration patterns are to coastal areas, that puts an additional strain on these ecosystems, on these coastal ecosystems that are already being strained by the impacts of climate change. That makes sense. And so, and then you add in tourism development, and that's bringing even more visitors on top of that migration. So it's just something that I think doesn't necessarily get highlighted a lot, but is, you know, when I think about what this means for Arctic coastal communities, we're relatively early in the tourism development expansion that a lot of coastal communities around the world have faced. You know, what does this mean for them, and how can they navigate these changes that are coming in a way that you know, benefits and you know, kind of benefit from the lessons learned of other coastal communities.
Fantastic. Are there any other kind of reactions or responses? We are coming up on time with 3 more minutes, and I believe that gives us enough time to answer another audience question if there are any, or any final comments from any of the panelists.
Well, I'm not sure if there's any other questions. I'm not seeing them in the chat. So just as a final note, as we're discussing these changes that are happening in the Arctic, the impact that it's having on local communities, and reflecting on the experiences of people around the world who have experienced similar things, who have been pushed to migration, to being deported, forcibly transferred from their lands. Again, just reverting back to the point that I think all of us were highlighting about having meaningful conversations, consultations, giving the chance for these communities to participate and finding ways to do that it's genuine and effective is so important. And it's so important to start those conversations, figure out how to do that now, because as Sarah was just saying, it's going to become more and more of a problem. It's going to lead to conflicts. So if we're thinking about these issues, how to bring in communities, how to protect their culture, and we're doing that now, I think we'll be better prepared as these issues arise more and more, and we learn from what's happened to other communities and try to remedy that and to change the way we do things so we can best support those communities and listen to what they need.
And can I raise an ethical issue that I have, and sort of end with my comments with this, and that is, in 30 seconds, these communities are not, they don't have one opinion on things, right? There are very, very diverse opinions, and they're penetrated by these hierarchies often that are reflecting the colonial histories, for instance, particularly in the high north there. And then what's my role? Is my role to support the emergence of these differences? Is my role to support the revelation of these oppositions and hierarchies? And what does it mean to do that? Theoretically, I would say it'd be a good idea that communities know themselves differently and better in that way. But I'm not at all convinced that a little old white lady from Washington, D.C. should be aspiring to support that kind of excavation and mixing it up with the communities that way, which, it leaves me wondering, what's my role as a researcher and what's my role as an engager? And I don't have the answer to that question. So I wanted to raise that puzzle.
Thank you. I think that's so important. Something that I grapple with as well, and trying to best represent clients as well. Thank you for raising that.
Yeah, very nice. ID.
Kristen, did you want to say a couple words to wrap up?
Just that when we're thinking about, I think tourism is it's the largest global industry. I think about it used to be 1 in 11. I think now it's 1 in 9 or 1 in 10 jobs globally are related to tourism. And when there's a lot of excitement over tourism development in the Arctic, and I think from a policy perspective, we all need to ask what kind of development that should be. People who don't live in the Arctic, why what's the relationship, this global sense of ownership to the Arctic, and kind of reflect on that, and then kind of understanding, and I think personal, that genuinely just personal reflections on individual sense of place, like what is each of our sense of place. I know in the US, we're a very transient or a lot of the population, I should say, is very transient. And what does that, do for your sense of place? Where you can have bits of yourself all over, and I think that's true for a lot of people around the world. And so kind of what is the collective and individual relationship to the Arctic, and how does that shape kind of these national and international policies that affect local communities in the Arctic.
Thank you so much, Kristen and Ide and Dr. Cobb and Dr. Martin for sharing your expertise and your work. And thank you to all the participants for being here and asking really interesting questions. And thank you to Peter and David for supporting on tech for the session.
Thank you, Sarah.
Hope everyone has a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thanks a lot.